No. All right. So today we're going to talk about the history of capitalism. Um, However, before we talk about the emergence of capitalism and what capitalism is, we need to talk about societies prior to capitalism so that we can understand what's distinct about capitalism as an economic and political system. We'll start more or less where we left off before, right, in the ancient world. However, this time our discussion will be rather Eurocentric. I apologize for that, but capitalism came out of Europe. So we got to see what are the historical circumstances that preceded the emergence of capitalism, and how did a confluence of events and circumstances create the circumstances that that led to the emergence of capitalism. Capitalism is not an inevitable part of human history, and like just about everything else we've been looking at is, a relatively recent invention in the human experience. It's less than 500 years old, or right about 500 years old. So we're going to get into that. So we're going to start today is with the Roman Empire, right? Last time we were talking about some of the Mesopotamian empires and empires of Central Asia, the Elamites, the Hittites, the Sumerians, the ancient Persians, and the Assyrians and Babylonians and Phoenicians and all that, right? So today we're going to bring it to Europe and talk about first the Roman Empire, and then we'll move into the Middle Ages and talk about medieval Europe before we move on to the emergence of capitalism. So the Roman Empire, remember we were talking about these different sweeps into Europe of different, language that are represented by different language families that we have remnants of or are aware of, and so the second one was the Tercinian language family, right, which the one that we're familiar with are the Etruscans. And the Etruscans were in northern Italy and were contemporaries of the Romans when Indo-European speakers, colonized middle and lower Italy. One of these groups started in Rome around, give or take 500 or so BC, right? And they flourished there and ended up, taking over, conquering surrounding areas, and eventually, conquering the whole Italian peninsula and on through most of Europe and North Africa and a big chunk of the Middle East, pretty much the whole known world at that time in that part of the world. And so, but when they started out, right, it's really picks up where we kind of left off last time, right? With the advent of sedentary agriculture, we're having, bigger and bigger towns now with thousands of residents who are being supported by, primarily by a grain supply and by animal husbandry, right? And the vast majority of the population works in the fields and, tending to the animals and whatnot. But there is, as sedentary agriculture and empires develop, there emerges a class of people who don't have to work, right? The ruling class. And these people emerge first as, people who are capable of violence, right? Who are capable of defending what's there. And also as religious, leaders and so forth, right? We talked about how, the grain supply itself kind of, led to the creation of organized religion. And so in the early Roman period, the Republican period, Roman society was split essentially between two classes, the patrician class and the plebeians. And so the plebeians are like the proletariat, the working class. They're the people who do most of the work. And the patricians are the ruling class, right? And so different patrician families came into control of swaths of land. And of course, they didn't work the land themselves, the plebeians worked the land, but they collected after everybody was fed so that the next year's harvest could continue, of course, right? Whatever was extra, they accumulated as profit, and whether they sold it or traded it or bartered it or whatever the case is, they were able to start accumulating wealth, right? And they would use this wealth to outfit themselves with armor and metal armor and weapons. We're well into the Bronze Age at this point, and eventually to arm and outfit the plebeians under that work for them, right? Also with weapons and armor. And this is the first. This is how the Roman military worked, right? Through the Republican period. Some rich Roman, some rich patrician would pay to, have all this armor and all these horses acquired and weapons and all of this kind of stuff, and all of the grain required to feed the army, right? And because he paid for the army, he became the general of the army, right? And so this is how Roman patricians, jockeyed for political position and status within Roman society by paying to form these armies, going and conquering some area, and then making off with the booty, everything they could steal, selling the people that weren't needed to work the fields locally into slavery, profiting from that, and then coming into control of an additional agricultural area that they could profit from, right? And so each Roman, patrician who would lead one of these armies out to conquer something, right, would not only acquire these material advantages and profit at other people's expense, but also would move up in the political ranks within Roman society, right? So the people who are elected as consuls, the leaders of the Roman Senate, were typically these people who were generals, but generals because they had paid for the armies that they were leading, right? And so the Romans conquered the Italian peninsula and then started to look northward. And the Roman you're probably most familiar with, right, is Julius Caesar, who was a Roman patrician, a member of an old Roman family, who took an army to Gaul, what's now France, and conquered the Franks, who were the predecessors to the people who live in France today. They were a Celtic people. They spoke a Celtic language family. The Frankish language was part of the Celtic family. And so in the aftermath of his conquest, because he was so wealthy and so powerful as a result of this, other Roman patricians conspired against him to undermine his political career. And in response, he had a coup d'etat and overthrew the Roman Senate, and it plunged, Rome into decades of civil war. He was assassinated by senators who were not happy, that he had nominated himself dictator for life. But his heir, Octavian, you probably know him as Caesar Augustus, ended up defeating all of their political rivals and became the first bona fide Roman emperor, right, to herald in the imperial period. And they just go around and just kill everybody that was there was a point in the Civil War where Octavian sent armed men to the villas, the mansions of all the patricians that had opposed him, and they just murdered them all like in one fatal swoop, right? And so that culminated in the Roman Empire, which is qualitatively different if you think about it in terms of property, right? Because now ostensibly the emperor owns everything, and he can remove anyone from their property holdings at any given time and have them assassinated and just turn over their property to somebody else, turn over their estate to someone else, right? So so it's not, you know, a person's business acumen doesn't necessarily, you know, put them in a position of great wealth. Their political connections to the emperor, and you know, through the remainder of Roman history, there were these struggles for power and coups d'états and different dynasties taking over and so on and so forth. But the imperial period differs significantly from the Republican period, where, you know, the land was owned essentially by different patricians. In the imperial period, there are patricians, but they only exist at the pleasure of the emperor, right? He can wipe out anyone and take everything that anyone has at any given time that he feels like. So eventually the Romans, bit off more than they can chew. And, they, at one time they controlled, basically the entire Mediterranean basin, Spain and France and, most of what's now Eastern Europe and the Middle East and pretty much all of North Africa, and, pretty deep into Germany as well, not all the way to Denmark, but, and so that's kind of eventually led to their downfall is, they really were hemmed in, not by their inability to keep conquering, but by, the climate and the terrain on their peripheries. On their southern periphery, what's south of North Africa is the Sahara desert, right? So that's pretty impassable, very difficult to pass all the way into sub-Saharan Africa. And if you go, west, of course, there's the Atlantic Ocean, and east, you run into another desert, right? In the Middle East, right? And north, first you run into very dense forests in what is now Northern Europe, right? Which is not conducive to the Romans' military strategy, their battle formations and that type of thing. And then eventually it just gets too cold, and so they were really hemmed in that way. But because to the north of them there was these regions that they couldn't fully penetrate, the people from up there, Germanic people and Gothic people, would come down into Roman lands, and either they would raid and fight with Rome, or they would try and join Rome. And Rome often used them as mercenary armies and so forth. So the Romans, thinking that they were superior to everyone, which is actually, if you think about it, it's kind of the flip of our racial taxonomy today, right? Our modern racial taxonomy is supposedly blue hair and blue eyes, blonde hair, blue eyes is at the top, and dark skin and black hair is at the bottom, right? In Roman times, it was actually the other way around. The Romans thought that, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired people from up north were scum of the earth, savages and barbarians. Our word actually comes from them. Actually, I think barbarian has an Etruscan root. Don't quote me on that. But like if you think that race existed in the ancient world, it was the other way around, right? The Romans thought those were the people that the Romans thought the least of. So they treated them poorly, and eventually they treated the wrong group of people poorly, and they flipped on the Romans and stormed Rome and burned it to the ground and stole everything that wasn't nailed down. Right now, the Roman Empire, we think of the Roman Empire as ending at that point, right? Because Rome fell, but it really didn't. The capital of Rome was not the capital of the Roman Empire was not in Rome at that time. It was in a city called Constantinople, which is now the city of Istanbul, right on the border of Turkey and Greece. And so the Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years in Constantinople through most of the Middle Ages until it eventually fell to the Turks. So let's move our conversation into the Middle Ages, right? So when the Roman imperial system collapsed, Europe fractured into more or less different kingdoms and principalities and towns and villages and cities and so on and so forth. And we call this system feudalism. And, it wasn't, a cookie cutter identical in every place, but this is more or less the way it worked, right? There would be a sovereign in an area, whether that was a king or, some high noble or an ecclesiastic authority, like in Rome, who ruled Rome and the surrounding areas was the Pope, or for a while, the Pope was in Ravenna in northern Italy. But in any case, there'd be a sovereign, right? And then there would be a noble class, the gentry. And they were the ones that had the lordships of the different land, this valley or this village or that town or whatever. And because they had the right to that, effectively they owned that. And they didn't just own the land, they owned everything there, because in theory, the king, the sovereign, owns everything. So the king is basically like leasing, not necessarily for money, though in many of these systems, the sovereign would extract tax revenue from localities. But the king would be like, okay, this is yours. You run that area. You collect. You live off those peasants, those serfs, right? And you basically own them. The serfs are tied to the land. They live in the same area, generation after generation after generation. Most people in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people never left a 10 square mile area in their whole life, right? They just lived in wherever they lived, and they worked the fields every season, and they were able to eat the food that they produced, and anything that was extra, the Lord would take, right? And maybe the king would get some, or whatever the case may be. And so who's the Lord? Who are these people that become these lords? Are the biggest, most violent men in the society, right? And so they have armor and weapons, and they're big and strong, and they, have a propensity for killing people. And so the deal is that the king gives them this: you don't got to do shit, you got to work, just make sure you stay bad to the bone, and all those peasants will work, and you can just live off of them, right? And when I need you, when I pick up the bat phone, right, you need to mount, posse up with not just you, but also anybody else. Maybe the peasants have to work in the fields, but there's some big dudes that could chop someone's head off, so they arm them and have armor and train them and so forth. So during the harvest season, everybody works except for the Lord, of course. And then when in the intermittent periods, people who are capable of violence train for violence, right? And then if the sovereign wants to fight a war to invade some other place, he calls on them, and they have to get all their armor and weapons and everything and posse up and head out to wherever it is they're going to meet up to fight this war, right? So if you think about this type of, this is a political system, but it's also an economy, right? And we call this direct production, right? Because pretty much everything that, the vast majority of people consume, right? All of the food, the commodities, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the tools you use to make the food and the clothes, pretty much everything you do and touch and use and have is produced in the local community, right? The only people who can really enjoy things from somewhere else, something that's not available in the local community, are the lords and the sovereign and so forth, right? And this is what wealth is. Wealth is something that comes from wealth, of course, as we talked. First of all, it's grain, and second of all, once sedentary agriculture is established, precious metals, gold and silver primarily, right? But wealth is also things that are produced far, far away that are not available in local markets, right? Spices to make your food edible, the native food of, the indigenous foods of Europe are not, not very flavorful. Let's put it that way, right? And so Europeans were wild for anything that would make their food a little more easy to get down their throat. Sugar, salt are the basic ones, but also many different spices, nutmeg, probably spices you don't even use anymore, or you associate maybe with holidays. Cloves, right? When do we cook with cloves? maybe when you make a ham for Christmas, right? But in the Middle Ages, like to be able to have some clothes to cook your food, that's a mean luxury. Only the ruling classes can afford that type of thing, right? And why is it such a luxury? Why is it so expensive? Because it's being brought from far, far away, right? So the lords essentially, were as wealthy or poor as their lands. If there was a lucky lord and he was on some lands that, were very productive, then he'd be living the high life, right? Maybe even better than the king. And some other lord might be on some scraggly land, or they might, be too greedy and not leave fields fallow and over farm the land, and then it wouldn't be productive anymore, right? And so you could be a lord, but you could be dead broke at the same time, right? So, so we call this, we call this feudalism, and the economic system is really a system of direct production, right? And so any wealth, right, there's really only two ways to accumulate wealth, right? One, and this isn't true in the ancient and the medieval world, right? One is to conquer new territory that you can then skim off the, the excess produce, right? If you get the more territory, the more fields and the more towns and villages and all that, then you have more to skim off of, right? And the other way is to go far, far, far away to retrieve some desirable, spice or dye, clothing dye, fabric, silk, cotton, so forth, and to bring it to Europe where it's not available locally, right? And same thing anywhere else in the world, right? You go to Africa in the Middle Ages, you go to, in Asia, especially the Chinese and Indians, they had everything, right? But anywhere you find wealthy people there, these trades are going to exist. And these trades were going on between Africa and South Asia and, in the Middle East long before the Europeans ever got involved, right? So we're going to talk about that in a second. But let's think about one more thing, which is, what purpose in the Middle Ages would someone have to hoard wealth in the first place, right? Like we kind of think about it in our society as well. You want to get more money, and how much is enough? Nothing's ever enough, right? We got people worth, $200 billion. Can't even wrap your mind around how much money that is, and it's just not enough, right? But in the Middle Ages, money was hoarded for, money, grain, wealth was hoarded for a very different reason. The first reason is that, harvests would not be consistent. And so there would be years of bad harvests that would bring about famine. And what happens when people start going hungry is they start showing up on the Lord's, doorstep with pitchforks and torches, right? So since the dawn of sedentary agriculture, the ruling classes in any society have had to contend with the threat of popular revolt, right? And so if there's a bad harvest and people can't be fed by their own local production, right? Well, then the Lord needs to open the grain silos, or if he has money, precious metals or whatever, to buy the grain that's needed to be able to get the population through the down year, right? Or else there would be a revolt and he could end up being killed, right? So that's really the most basic reason to hoard. It wasn't, so the dragon could play in the coins like in Lord of the Rings, there were no dragons, all that. It had nothing to do with, nobody even had, a dungeon full of gold coins. No, not that many gold coins out there. But that was essentially why, and of course, some of it was in coinage, but also a lot of wealth was in, you go into the house of wealthy people and the candlesticks would be made out of gold or silver. The fixtures would be made out of precious metals, this, that, and the other, right? So it's not just coins in a chest somewhere buried in the ground, right? What's the other purpose of hoarding wealth in the Middle Ages and, you know, in ancient times, same as the Romans, right? It's to raise armies, to arm, you know, peasants and nobles alike, right? To be able to go and fight and capture new territory, right? Either for, you know, economic advantage or for status or political reasons. So anybody have any questions about any of that before I start talking a little bit about economics a little bit more?
Hi, Professor. About the first reason that why was money hoarded for, I put that harvest was not being consistent. Was that what you said?
Yeah, so because the harvests weren't consistent and there would be famine, right? People would, you know, or not people, but, you know, lords and kings and sovereigns and whatnot would have to hoard wealth, whether in the form of grain or precious metals, coins, gold and silver, whatever.
Oh, okay.
So that, you know, they could feed everyone if the local grain supply was not sufficient.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you.
You can't let all your serfs die, because then the next season you got to plant again, who's gonna do the work, right? And not to mention they're gonna show up on your doorstep and want to chop your head off. So, you know, they weren't hoarding wealth, you know, for the sake of having wealth, right? It was a defense strategy and also a source of raising armies to conquer additional territory, hopefully to increase their holdings and so on and so forth. Any other questions about any of that before I get into mercantilism? So in the Middle Ages, capitalism, you know, capitalism didn't exist in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't possible for different reasons, right? And so one of the basic ones is that how finance is done in a capitalist system, right? In a capitalist system, in our system, if you want to start a business, buy a house or a car or whatever, you want to go to college, what do? You borrow the money, right? From the bank or some lending house, a bank basically, right? And they charge you interest on that, right? Probably too much. And then, you know, you pay over the course of your life, you know, and because of the interest, you end up paying a lot more than you actually needed to borrow in the first place, right? And that's where the bank makes its money, right? Well, that whole system didn't really exist prior to capitalism, right? Prior to 500 years ago, right, there was this banking system that we have didn't exist, right? Even in the beginning years of capitalism. The primary reason for that is theological. And this is true for all the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all forbid money lending and particularly collecting interest on loans. right? It's in the Torah, it's in the Bible, and it's in Quran. And the reason it's in all three is because it has the same root, right? This is a long, this is an ethical value that goes, back thousands of years, that money lending is a dirty trade, right? And that, and this actually stayed true in Muslim controlled areas until modern times. Like a true, we'll see what the Taliban does in Afghanistan, but a true Sharia law would not allow banks to exist, would not allow anyone to lend money. The idea is that, that if you're wealthy and your neighbor is poor, you shouldn't be lending them or giving them things because you're trying to exploit them. You should be doing it out of charity, out of humility, right? And so, and this is, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, what was wealth was, in animals and grain and things like that, right? So if you have a flock of 100 sheep and your neighbor has nothing to feed his family, in Islam, every 5 years, you have to give 20% of your wealth to those less fortunate than you. So you would have to break off 20 of your sheep and give it to someone who has less sheep than you, right? And then that way, everybody has enough to be able to support their families, right? Now, even though all three religions, in the Abrahamic tradition have this ban, during the Middle Ages, Jewish people relaxed it to some extent. And that's really a function of the unfortunate position they found themselves in. Jewish people had been scattered all throughout Europe by the Jewish diaspora, which resulted because during Roman times, there was a revolt in Judea, which was one of the Roman provinces. And actually, there's an English word that draws itself from the Jewish rebels, zealotry, the zealots. The zealots were Jewish rebels who were sick of the Romans and were down to give their own lives to resist the Romans and to fight against them, even if they knew they'd all be killed, which they were. And to punish the Jews, the Romans, ravaged Judea and sold Jews into slavery and spread them all throughout the Roman Empire. So that's why Jewish people are spread all throughout North Africa and Europe, is because of this diaspora that was caused by the Romans. And so during the Middle Ages, through this time, Jewish communities maintained their religion, right? And also to an extent, depending on location and time, their language, right? At least with the rabbis. And so they, throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, they were an oppressed population in most of Europe, and not everywhere. Like in Spain for a long time, Muslims ruled Spain for 800 years. Christians have only ruled it for 500. And during Muslim rule in Spain, Jews, basically had the same political and social and economic rights as other members of the society. But in Christendom, Jews were always, the most, or one of the most marginalized internal, subordinate populations. And so they were forbidden from most of the activities that, the trades that people would engage in to make money and to support themselves. So they weren't allowed to join any of the trade guilds. They couldn't be a blacksmith or a stone mason or whatever. They couldn't serve in any government capacity, so they were very limited in what they could do economically. And so the rabbis basically, interpreted the Torah that you can't lend money to other Jews, but you can lend to Gentiles. And so some Jewish families in different cities throughout different parts of Europe found this kind of niche business that they could engage in to be able to support their families generation after generation. And the business will be passed on from fathers to sons and so forth, right? And so this isn't, there's all these anti-Semitic, racist ass tropes about Jews own the banks and all this nonsense. Now the newest version is this QAnon nonsense. I hope you guys aren't brainwashed with that QAnon nonsense, please. But this is where it comes from. Jewish people did not choose money lending because it would lead to them ruling the world or whatever this conspiracy nonsense thinks. They weren't allowed to engage in any of the trades, and let's put ourselves back in the Middle Ages. Money lending is considered a sin, a dirty business. So money lending only became an important part of the economy because of capitalism. Prior to capitalism, money lending was not a business most people wanted to be in, and certainly not Christians, because in their mind, if you engage in money lending, your soul's going to hell, right? So to them, it's just another reason to hate Jewish people is, oh, look, they're lending money and they're all going to hell, whatever. So essentially, money, the banking system that we have today wasn't possible in the Middle Ages because of this, this difficulty in lending money, right? It was something that was, it's not like Jewish people were lending money out and then just, like they would lend money to people, and then the people that they owed them the money would accuse them of something and try to kill them instead of paying them back. Like horrible things happened all through the Middle Ages to Jewish people. So being in this position was not ideal, and it's it wasn't a stable business. Let's put it that way, right? Like banking is today is a bedrock institution of our society. It's just not possible for that type of thing to have existed during the Middle Ages because of this theological, ban on money lending. So as we mentioned, how are people making their fortunes? They're either conquering new lands, right? Or they're trying to bring spices and things from far away, right? Except through the Middle Ages, how do they get spices and silks and dyes and stuff from South Asia and from the South Pacific? They got to get it through middlemen, from Muslims, basically, right? The trade goes through the Middle East. And so one way or another, they're not getting it from the source. They know the source is out there. Maybe there's some enterprising European merchants who've individually managed to trek all the way to China or India, or managed to convince some, Muslim traders to take them on their boat from Arabia or from the East African coast or whatever the case is. So they know it's out there, right? But, like the classic example of that is Marco Polo, right? It's not just a game that we played as kids in the pool. Marco Polo, no. So Marco Polo is this, guy so he traveled from supposedly Italy to China, and, the journey actually happened. It actually was a religious thing. They were bringing they're bringing priests from Italy to the Khan in China. But that's your kind of historical reference. There's a very entertaining docudrama on Netflix called Marco Polo. The history is atrocious, and the plot line is ludicrous, but it's kind of entertaining if you want to watch something while you're falling asleep at night. But anyways, so Europeans are stuck with this middleman situation, right? But they know there's got to be some other way to get there. Now, the problem is, we know what the globe looks like. So it's obvious, how do you get there? You take a boat around Africa, and then you come up the Indian Ocean, and then you're in South Asia, right? But Europeans, through most of the Middle Ages, being the sophisticated, civilization that Europe is, thought that the Earth was flat, and that if they would sail too far into the Atlantic Ocean, they would fall off the end of the Earth. They really believed this, and so they believed it to the point that kings, sovereigns in Europe could not get people to get on a boat and to test this. just sail out there and see if you fall off or not, and come back if you don't, right? So finally, the King of Portugal, in the early 15th century, I think like 1411 or something like that, convinced, offered this rewards, put up all this gold, or I forgot, I'm sure it was gold he was putting up, to finance, anybody who's down to go find the end of the world, right? If you come back, all this is yours, right? So somebody took him up on it. I forgot the guy's name. Yeah, I'm not going to remember that right now. But somebody took him up on it and sailed a boat, down the West African coast, further than anyone ever had. They knew Morocco was there. They'd been going back and forth to Morocco, but went past Morocco, past the Sahel to, kind of like what's now, I guess that would be Western Sahara is the country that's in that region of Africa, and found some people living there and traded them whatever they had and went back to Portugal. Hey, look, we didn't fall off the end of the earth, and there's some fucking people living down there, and look, we got all this cool stuff, and we can go back down there and probably start something up. I don't know, we'll see what. So once and this was a huge state secret for the Kingdom of Portugal, right? Because they don't want the rest of Europe to find out, oh shit, there's no end of the world, you can just keep going, right? So they want this for themselves. And why do they want it? Because they want to bring commodities that are not available in local markets from far away to Europe, to make money off of it. That's the only way, other than conquering new territory, which Portugal has never been in a very good position to do. They're lucky to have their own country, as a matter of fact, right? And so they start this trade, and they start, floating their boats a little bit further down, and then if you're familiar with the African continent, it cuts in, you cut a little, then you're along the West African coast, what's now, Liberia, Ghana, Benin, Togo, Nigeria, eventually they get even further down, past Equatorial Guinea to Angola, and Namibia is below Angola. Am I right about that? And eventually, and everywhere they go, they're finding, guess what? There's already civilizations there, and they already have markets going where they're selling all kinds of useful stuff that Europeans want, particularly gold and slaves, right? Now, Europeans have long known that gold comes from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa. From Roman times, they've known this. Actually, most of the gold coins minted by the Romans, like if you go online and you buy one of these things from 2,000 years ago, that gold came from West Africa. Like if you do, they do a test to find out where in the world the gold came from West Africa, almost all of it, right? And there was after the death of Muhammad, the death of the prophet, right? Arabs swept right across North Africa and East Africa, and eventually Muslims penetrated the Sahel, the region below the Sahara, and into West Africa, right? To what was for hundreds of years, the Empire of Ghana. But the Empire of Ghana fell on its own, and these Muslims established a new state there, the Kingdom of Mali. And this Kingdom of Mali controlled most of West Africa, particularly the gold trade and the slave trade and the salt trade. A city you might be familiar with that came out of this was Timbuktu, one of the first universities in the world, actually, also in Timbuktu. So anyways, actually the wealthiest man in history was the king of Ghana, the king of Mali at one time, Mansa Musa, who had made this famous pilgrimage to Mecca. As a Muslim, you have to go to Mecca once in your life for pilgrimage, for Hajj. And along the way, he handed out so much gold to everyone that he crashed the gold markets all through North Africa and the Middle East for like 20 years because he gave away so much free gold. So Europeans had heard these stories and were very interested, right? And so when the Portuguese finally found this coast where the gold and the slaves come from, people with darker skin, they started cutting deals themselves. And, they weren't there to colonize, right? They weren't there to conquer and become the rulers or nothing like that. They were there to trade commodities that were not available locally in Europe. And so they would set up forts along the coast and trade with the, the Arab, not necessarily Arab, many of them were native West African, but the Muslim traders, right, who were operating in West Africa. And they were buying what they were already selling, which was gold and slaves, right? Prior to that, we're going to talk about this more in a couple of weeks when we talk about the history of the race concept. But prior to that, slaves from West Africa were being sent north to North Africa and then into Mesopotamia, into Muslim-controlled lands. So this is now Europeans are arriving on this coast and say, hey, we want some slaves too. We'll take them back to Portugal and they can work in our fields and our castles and that kind of thing, right? And of course, they want the gold. And what do they have to trade? They have what people in West Africa don't have, manufactured goods, right? So primarily firearms is really what people in West Africa were after, right? And so they would bring and trade firearms and shot and powder and whatnot and take gold and slaves back to Portugal. And all the while they keep going, and eventually they find out, hey, you can just sail right around the southern tip of South Africa and you're like in a whole new ocean, right? We come up to the coast of East Africa, right? You hit the Indian Ocean, the jet stream. There's a current that goes from the East African coast to what's now India, Pakistan, maybe part of Iran, right? And human beings have known about this for millennia. There, you can get in a boat on the East African coast in, what's now Tanzania, Kenya, Somalia, whatever, and jump in the water, and you don't really have to do much. The current floats you straight to India, right? And then you wait 6 months for the season to change and get back in your boat and you float straight back to East Africa, right? And who knows, maybe those, indigenous people of Papua New Guinea and the Aboriginal Australians, maybe they didn't walk all the way there. Maybe they caught that free ride to India and then walked from there or whatever, who knows? But we know for sure that trade has been going on between South Asia and East Africa since ancient times, for sure. We, certainly prior to the birth of Christ. And we have some sources, there's, I think, Greek and Roman sources that talk about the trade between East Africa and India. So this has been going on a long time. So suddenly the Portuguese arrive and like, oh shit, look, there's everything we want is out here. And they show up in East Africa and they have all this stuff they want. Where did this come from? Right? Oh, you just jump in your boat and boom, you'll be over there in 2 months, 1 month or whatever it takes to float that little mission. Right? And so they start going to India and to China and to South Asia and so forth. Actually, I got a little, let me show you a little map here. Just to give you an idea what we're talking about. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys can see it? Cool. So this is tiny little Portugal over here, right? And so they thought if you sail past this, you're gonna die and fall off the end of the earth. And then they got down to here and they established something. Then they got a little further down and a little further down and down and down and down and all the way around to East Africa. And then took that current just straight across the Indian Ocean and ended up over here and eventually into, what's now Indonesia and Malaysia. So what were they trying to do here? They were trying to get to the source, right? So that they could trade directly from the source and bring it straight back to Europe and not have to pay any middlemen in between, right? But they have a problem. They show up over here in India and China, which are like the most advanced civilizations in the world at this point, right? And Europe is like this, podunk backwater, region of the world that is, considered backwards, by pretty much everyone else. And what do they have to trade for the stuff they want? Nothing that people in India or China want. You you got nothing of value. Sorry, we invented gunpowder. Like, we're not impressed. You know, we don't want your little guns. We don't, you know, we already rule the world. We don't need to invade anybody. Sorry, we don't want your trinkets and your beads and your baubles, right? We are the greatest civilization on earth. So the Portuguese are kind of stuck, like, damn, what do we have to bring something that they do want. And so what do they want? Silver or gold or slaves, right? So what they have to do is they have to go from Portugal, take manufactured goods to East Africa, to West Africa, and then take the gold and the slaves all the way to India and South Asia, trade them for the spices and silks and dyes and whatever they want, right? And then make a return trip all the way back to Portugal with all of it, and then back around again, right? So this is happening over the course of the 15th century. Now, they try a number of strategies, right? They try to strong arm their way and force the people they're trading with to do what they want. That doesn't work because there's not very many of them, right? And you have massive countries here with, you know, unlimited people. You're just not going to win that battle, right? And they try to, you know, set up forts where they can control, you know, who gets to trade, and they can tax everyone that's trading, you know. So as people from East Africa and the Middle East are trading there, they can intercept them and force them to, and basically extort them as they're, you know, heading back with their cargoes. And they also decided to try, you know, they started in West Africa. There's some islands over here, San Tome and Principe, Sao Tome in Portuguese, sorry. And when they arrived on these islands, they were uninhabited, but they had good soil. And so they decided, you know, instead of transporting this sugar all this far distance, why don't we just start growing it ourselves over here? So they started their first, you know, sugar plantations there in Sao Tome. And there aren't very many people in Portugal, so they couldn't like transport enough Portuguese there to do all the labor. And Portuguese were not interested on going and living on some island in the middle of nowhere, right? So what did they do to populate the island is they kidnapped the children of Jewish families and took their children away from them and sent them to Sao Tome. And they sent as the surrogate families to raise them as good Catholics, all of the undesirables, criminals, prostitutes, you know, people in prison, so on and so forth. So alcoholics, you know, anyone that they didn't, you know, that was just a burden, they pack them all in a ship along with the poor Jewish children and send them all to Sao Tome to be a nice, you know, little settler colony there, right? And then, of course, that's not enough people to do the labor. So they're already buying slaves from Muslims off the West African coast. So they start bringing people from West Africa over there to do the work. So you kind of see this system develop, right? This is called mercantilism. So this isn't capitalism, right? This is really, if you think about it, the same thing that people have been doing from ancient times. They're going far away to get something that's not available in local markets. And the reason that it's valuable enough to make, you know, to turn a profit from is because, you know, you're traveling this huge distance and taking all these risks and so forth to acquire these things, right? And so when they find the New World, right, of course, you know, the Spanish, well, Columbus discovered the New World, right? Columbus was actually Italian, but he was sailing in an expedition financed by the Spanish crown, just as these people were sailing in expeditions financed by the Portuguese crown. And so he found, you know, Hispaniola, what's now DR, Dominican Republic. But the Portuguese, you know, right around like within 10 years, you know, had found Brazil. And so they essentially used Brazil to produce sugar at first, taking, you know, as part of this triangle trade, right? They would be taking slaves and gold from West Africa to South Asia. They'd be taking slaves to Brazil. They'd be taking spices and silks and dyes from South Asia back to Portugal, and taking sugar from Brazil back to Portugal as well, right? So they're just going in every different direction, just trying to get their hands on as much of these, desired commodities that are not available in Europe, to import as much of it as they can, because it's not just Portugal consuming this stuff, they're selling it to the rest of Europe, obviously, right? And so they more or less have a monopoly on this trade. And it's not, individual entrepreneurs who are doing this. The Portuguese crown is financing and controlling all of this, right? So these aren't, independent operators. This is the Portuguese crown doing this. So now let me talk to you a little bit about the Dutch mercantile trade, and then we'll take a break before we move into England and agrarian capitalism. So much of Europe during the 14th and 15th, most of Europe during the 14th and 15th century was controlled by what we call the Habsburg Empire, which was the ruler of Spain at the time that the New World was discovered. And, when the Aztecs, the Mexica and the Inca, were conquered and obliterated by the Spanish. They were conquered in the name of Charles V, who was not just the King of Spain, he was the Habsburg Emperor. And the Habsburg Emperor stretched, from the New World, Europe, and and in the all the way out in the Philippines, and so they called the empire the sun never sets, right? And so the Habsburgs at one time controlled, what's now this region, which is the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And Belgium and Luxembourg were Catholic, but the Dutch had converted to Protestantism, right? They basically cut the Pope loose, right? And so because they were opposed to being dominated by the Habsburgs, who were Catholics, they basically had a war of independence, and got their independence from Spain, from the Habsburgs. And they very quickly became very enterprising merchants, in part due to they had very superior ship designs. The ships that they floated were of a special design that there were actually a couple different designs, some that were designed for carrying massive amounts of cargo, and others for being very fast and maneuverable and good fighting ships. And so they basically followed the Portuguese this whole same route, right, with an eye basically to jack the Portuguese and anyone else they could for whatever they could, right? So it's really started as like what we would consider piracy. They would go and they captured this huge ship in the Indies all the way over here, this huge Portuguese ship, like around, I don't know, 1500 or something like that. And it was worth so much money what was on this ship in spices and commodities from South Asia, that the Dutch, the East India Company, which was again a state-run monopoly, right? The value of it increased by 50% just by stealing that one ship, right? So they were doing this, just stealing whatever they could, trying to attack Portuguese forts that were already there and take them over, and thereby take over the trade and take over the extortion racket of trying to extort other ships that were, going back and forth from the Middle East and East Africa to South Asia. So basically trying to thug their way into the South Asian economy, same way the Portuguese had done. And, they couldn't, of course, they were no match for, who the empires that were in India and China and so forth. So they, basically did the same thing the Portuguese did and tried to set up these little colonies, which the purpose of them wasn't to rule territory, right? It's not like the type of settler colonialism that became America, right? They're really interested in the same thing that people were interested all through the Middle Ages and ancient times, which is bringing commodities great distance, right? And they were just trying to monopolize the source of those commodities, whereas through most of the Middle Ages and ancient history, they had to get these things through middlemen, right? So they would go and, find out where the islands where nutmeg was being made, right? Which is in down here in what's now Indonesia. I think this is Java and this is Sumatra. So I think nutmeg was from some region around Sumatra. And so they went there and, colonized that area, not to colonize the people. They let the people run their own affairs. The people there that were producing the nutmeg were self-governing, but the Dutch wanted all the nutmeg to go to them. So they would be the ones to bring it back to Europe and to sell it and to control that trade, right? And it's actually funny because you can really see that the capitalist mindset that we have today, right? That was just starting with this mercantile business that the Europeans were engaging in, didn't exist in the rest of the world. People just didn't think like, oh, I need to amass huge wealth, for what? Right. So they would be engaged in this trade with the locals who are making these spices and, supply and demand, right? If there's more demand, then the supplier increases supply, right? Because if there's more demand, the price increases. And so the increased price motivates the supplier to produce more so they can make even more money, right? That's the supply and demand, price balance, right? And they're bringing this stuff back to Europe, and people in Europe are like, more, we can't get enough, right? But what are the indigenous people of Sumatra? What's their perspective? Very different, right? The more money the Dutch give them for the spices, the less spices they produce. Why? Because they only want what they need for their own subsistence. Like, we live in the tropics, like we swim in the ocean every day, like we live a wonderful life. What do we need all this money for? Like, so they would just sell as much spice as they need to get whatever they wanted, and then that's it, like for their own consumption needs. The idea of, accumulating wealth beyond one's own, immediate consumption needs, just their minds didn't work like that, right? It just didn't occur to them, right? So as the prices are skyrocketing in Europe, they're actually producing less of the stuff because they get more for, hey, they got what takes less to get what, why work so hard, right? Better to enjoy life. So this is the mercantile system, right? And this is really the same system that's going on, in the Middle Ages. This is not capitalism, right? Just because people are trading and making profit and making money doesn't mean that's capitalism, right? The Spanish too. Look at Spanish colonialism, right? What was how were they extracting wealth from Spanish colonies? Well, first of all, they hit the jackpot, and one of the biggest silver, veins, silver loads in the world is in Mesoamerica, right? Is in the area that the Aztecs were controlling, what's now the Mexican state of Zacatecas. Most of the silver, like if you're wearing silver jewelry right now, do an analysis and it probably came from Zacatecas, right? Who knows how many hundreds of years and how many pieces of jewelry it's been turned into, but that's where it was probably brought out of the ground. And there's a significant gold deposits, not on the level of West Africa, but significant gold deposits in the northern part of South America where the Incas were, right? That's why the Spanish conquered the Incas, and some gold deposits in Mesoamerica as well. So the Spanish, colonial economy is pretty simple. Melt down as much gold and silver as you can and ship it back to Spain, right? And that's not too complicated. That's not capitalism, that's plunder, right? And even when they did start plantations in, in the New World, in Mesoamerica and South America and the Caribbean and stuff. Same thing the Portuguese were doing. They were just trying to produce some sugar to ship back to Europe, right? And who was doing the labor in these plantation systems, right? It's really not a whole lot different than the feudal system, right? Some nobleman is given the right to the encomienda by the Spanish crown. This isn't like an enterprising entrepreneur who, flipped some Bitcoin and bought himself an encomienda. No, the king said, this is yours, right? And all of the indigenous people who live there become your property, just like the serfs would be your property in Europe, right? And they have to work. And if they won't work, or they all die off and kill them or whatever, well, then worst comes to worst, they can bring slaves from West Africa, right? And they did bring a lot of slaves to Mesoamerica, to what's now Mexico. Up until the mid 17th century, actually, Mexico, for a good 50 years was the foremost recipient of slaves, even above Brazil, which in the long run, the vast majority of people who got shipped, who were sold in Muslim slave markets in West Africa and ended up in the New World, most of them ended up in Brazil. But the conditions were so horrible that, very few of them survived. So, but anyways, we'll get a little bit more into that stuff in a couple of weeks. But that's mercantilism. Any questions about any of that before we take a break and then start talking about the origins of capitalism? So that's our background. Cool. All right, so it's 7:09 now. Let's come back at 7:20. See you guys in 11 minutes. conspired against him to undermine of England. Okay, so talked about all the other colonial powers of Europe. Let's talk about England. So before we get into capitalism and colonialism and all that, let's do a little bit of history first, just so you can kind of get an idea of the political context and what's going on in England, in the century prior to this all happening, right? And so we'll start with the War of the Roses. Have you guys ever heard of that? It was a popular movie, I think in the 90s or something. Maybe I'm dating myself. But anyways, the War of the Roses was a series of civil wars in England in the late 15th century that lasted about, 30 years or something like that. And was essentially a war between two of these noble, these lords, these noble houses, the Lancasters and the Yorks. And because of the Civil War, pretty much everyone else, all the other, gentry of the country had to take sides one way or the other, right? Including in what's now France, right? Many of you may not know, but actually the royal family of England for the last, 800 years or something, is actually French. They're Normans, which actually the Normans are originally from where? Norway. So actually they're Vikings by way of France. And so the kings of England were also the kings of parts of what's now France, and there's been a relationship between them. And so like Brittany took this, I think Brittany took the side of the Yorks or whatever. So there were these two sides, basically, two factions, and they represent themselves by a red and a white rose. That's why they called it the War of the Roses. And the Lancasters and their allies wore a red rose, like on their shields or, in their armor or whatever. And the Yorks wore a white rose so they could identify each other in battle. And they basically kept the king, kidnapped the king and kept him, as their little like football. And whoever had the football got to run the country until the other side would flip, and then they'd kidnap the king back. And through all this period, the male heads of both houses ended up getting killed, along with the male heads of most of the houses, most of the lords. This war was just ruinous for the ruling classes because it was a civil war among the ruling classes, and many of them, back in those days, in these days, peasants fight wars for ruling classes in every case. The rich people don't go out and lead armies anymore, but back then they did. And so they'd actually died, a whole group of them, died in this series of wars, right? And the end of the thing is kind of a convoluted genealogical mess, but someone who's, distantly related to the Lancasters married someone who's distantly related to the Yorks and militarily established control of the government, and the war was over. And so that's the House of Tudor, Tudor. Should I put that? This is not that important, but just for your own historical knowledge. And probably the figure you're most familiar with from the House of Tudor is Henry VIII. We'll talk about him in a second, but let's talk about his father, who was far more cunning and ruthless a man, who established the dynasty. I have a picture of him here from his, you guys can see that from the Wikipedia. Wikipedia is pretty good. Like if you're looking at historical stuff and, or sociology or whatever, most Wikipedia pages are written by graduate students. So, most of the stuff is accurate. This is a picture of old Henry VII. I'd be scared as shit if you looked at me like that. I was a vicious dude. So he established the line, and he was a, very competent and, solid, king and all that. And unfortunately, his son, let's see, I have his son here. Henry VIII was his heir. This rather rotund fellow. Picture him. He was actually apparently the paragon of athletic fitness in his 20s. He was a big hit on the jousting circuit and so forth. But in his middle age, apparently he was a little well fed. So anyways, despite his rotund figure, he was a ladies' man, probably too much. And had a series of wives and heirs, a convoluted series of wives and heirs that really messed up the line of succession for the English crown. With the sovereign, the king thing, the deal is that the king has a son, and that's the prince, and then he becomes the king when the king dies, right? And then he has another son, and then but what happens if there's no son? Back then, fuck. Nobody would know. It's never happened before, right? What do we do? So another thing they were not aware of in the Middle Ages, which young men, if you're not aware, now you are, whether you have a boy or a girl child is determined by the male half of the pair, right? And so, blame yourself if you're not happy with, the outcome, which you should blame yourself if you're not happy about your child being born in the first place. You have a serious problem. But Henry was one of these, being the king, he's got to have a male heir. And so his first wife really should have worked out lovely, would have changed world history, forever after. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, the heir to the Spanish throne. And so if they had successfully had a son, and that son had been king, he wouldn't have just been king of England. He would have been king of England and Spain, right? He would have been in line for the Habsburg throne, right? But unfortunately for Henry, that didn't happen for him. And he had only girls with Catherine, only one of whom survived to adulthood. We'll talk about her in a minute. But being unsatisfied with his, attempts at producing an heir with Catherine, and not being very fond of Catherine, in a romantic sense, he fell in love with one of his mistresses, who was a courtier named Anne Boleyn, and wanted to divorce poor Catherine and lock her in a tower and marry Anne Boleyn. But of course, England is a Catholic country at this time, like most of Europe. And what do you think the Pope's got to say about that? Right? Just even today, like if you're Catholic and your wife wants a divorce, and like your priest will do anything to keep you guys together, right? Like divorce is a big no-no in Catholic culture, right? And so of course the Pope's like, you're out of your fucking mind. You want to divorce the daughter of the King of Spain? Are you out of your mind? What are you thinking, right? So he's thinking with his little head, and he says, fuck the Pope. I'm going to make my own church, and I'm going to call it the Church of England, and I'll be the Pope of the Church of England. And that's what he did. He told the Pope, screw you, damn me to hell if you like, excommunicate me. I'm not under your purview anymore. I'm divorcing poor Catherine here and locking her in a tower somewhere, and I'm going to marry Anne Boleyn. How about that? Right? And that church still exists today. It's actually quite popular here in the US among Protestant denominations, and that is the Episcopalian Church, right? Any Episcopalians out there? It's the practice of Episcopalians is almost identical to that of Catholics, except that they don't recognize the Pope, right? So anyways, there's lots of Episcopalian churches out there if you'd like to join one. They tend to be rather progressive politically, at least in contemporary American society. But anyways, so that's the Church of England. So he married Anne Boleyn, and same thing, had a daughter. Damn, right? No son. And, Henry's getting pretty worried at this point. He's supposed to be the paragon of masculinity. And yet here he is with no son. Went through all this trouble just to not have a son all over again. Right. And so he's, of course, like most narcissists, angry at Anne Boleyn for this state of affairs. Right. Doesn't realize that it's actually his material that's the problem. And so he chops Anne Boleyn's head off. I mean, she was cheating with the King of England. You play big stakes, you lose big stakes, right? So she died, and he married another courtier named Jane Seymour, and had a son finally with Jane Seymour, his third wife. But she unfortunately died as a result of complications as a result of childbirth. So that was the only son he got out of that. And that son was very sickly and was pretty young when he died. Let me think. The son must have been about 10 years old, Edward IV. Oh, I got his picture somewhere, I think. Let me find young Edward here. Young Edward. Edward VI, my bad, not Edward IV. And so I think Edward was 10 when Henry died, and he became king. But of course, a child doesn't rule a country, so regents were ruling in his stead. And he died when he was 15, I think, something like that. So he ruled for 5 or 6 years. Maybe he was 9. Anyways, so you're basically a child, and was sick for really the last couple of years with a chronic, some kind of bronchial infection, or we don't know exactly what it was. But eventually he died when he was 15. And there was an attempt at a coup d'etat to install someone, and the guy who tried to pull that off, he ended up losing his head too. Gamble big, lose big. And eventually, this lovely woman, for whom popular libation is named, became the first Queen of England. Bloody Mary. You guys like Bloody Marys? Brunch on Sundays? It's like a gaba michelada. Right? Instead of tahini, they use pepper. But the tomato base, instead of beer, you use vodka. So anyways, why do they call it the Bloody Mary? Because it's red and it looks like blood. And old Bloody Mary spilled a lot of blood in her. I think she ruled for only maybe 5 years. And she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the poor woman, Henry's first wife, who got locked in the Tower. And so Mary never forgot about all that. And so being the daughter of the, Catherine of Aragon of Spain, Mary was a devout Catholic, and, put the U-turn on that whole Church of England thing, right? So she forced the country to convert back to Catholicism, which many people were happy about. There were a whole lot of people in England who thought their souls were going to hell because Henry damned them all by telling the Pope to fuck off, right? So a lot of people were, when Mary first became queen, people were happy. Oh yeah, we can be Catholic again. Hell yeah, we're not going to hell anymore. Our sins are absolved, whatever. So that didn't turn out well. In short order, she just started killing people. Pretty much anyone that she suspected of anything, she had killed. So, by the end of her rule, pretty much anybody, who was anybody, had been killed, either because of the civil wars through the Wars of the Roses, or because they, unfortunately fell in Mary's disfavor. The traditional landowning gentry, the traditional lords, had pretty much been liquidated, right? And she died after only 5 years, also because of health problems. I don't think they know what she died of. I think it's a mystery. I don't recall. Maybe some type of cancer. We don't know. And so all of England rejoiced because, they were tired of being killed by her for no reason. And somehow, some way, the daughter of Anne Boleyn managed to keep her head down during that 5 years Mary was in power and survive. And being the next born, child of the previous king, she was named Queen Elizabeth I. And she ruled for a good over 40 years, maybe 50 years, does it say here? Reign, 15, yeah, over 45 years, yeah. Which is, shit, most people back then didn't even live 45 years, right? So she, she's famous monarch in, English history. And we won't go any further than that, but she was a very shrewd woman. She was the virgin queen. She never married because she was fearful that if she married, then her husband would be able to usurp her. So she did have lovers and whatnot, but she never married. And she basically redistributed the estates, the landed estates throughout the country to people who were loyal to her. So she basically carved up the whole country and assigned everything to someone, right? And so let's stop for a second and think about, why don't I X her out so we can, let's stop and think about, right? What are the ways to increase your wealth at this time, right? You can go and conquer some new territory, but not in England. You're on an island, right? And all the other territory on the island is been apportioned by the queen. You can't, it's not like you can finagle your neighbor's estate into yours, and it's not going to happen, right? So you can't expand your holdings. You're not a part of, you're excluded from this mercantile monopoly that Portugal and the Dutch are running to South Asia, right? And so you have to innovate in order to increase your wealth. That's the only way, right? And so they made this innovation partly through what was I going to say? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Let me see so they made this innovation partly as a result of the theological implications of the transition from Catholicism to Protestantism, right? And we call this in sociology the Protestant ethic, right? So you guys have probably read, Weber in your social theory class if you're a social major, or you will. But I'll just give you a little review right here, just in case you haven't already. So the Protestant ethic is the idea that when people separated from the Catholic Church, right, it creates a doubt and anxiety about your fate in the afterlife, right? If you're Catholic, right, how do you know that you're going to heaven? Because you're a baptized member of the Catholic Church in good standing. The Pope hasn't excommunicated you, and your sins are absolved as long as you confess and you go to heaven, right? Everybody goes to heaven as long as you check those boxes right there. But if you told the Pope to go fuck himself because you wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, right? Then you don't got that box to check off anymore. There's no real authority to assuage your concerns that, you just confess your sins, God will forgive you, you're going to heaven, right? So once the country and Elizabeth, reverted back to Church of England from Mary trying to make it Catholic again, so went back and forth. So we've got a Protestant country here, and people are really concerned about, am I going to go to heaven? Am I going to go to hell? How do I know if I'm going to go to heaven or hell? Or what indication could, if the Pope isn't there to tell us who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, then what indications could there be of who has God's favor and who doesn't, right? And so wealth started to be kind of a symbol of that you have God's favor and that you're probably going to be among the saved instead of the damned, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what the origin of capitalism now, which is what we call collectively the enclosure movement. So if someone ever asks you, when did capitalism start? The enclosure movement is the answer. I'm going to type that out. As in to enclose land. And so, people in England are seeing all this money that Spain and Portugal and the Dutch are making, right? And they don't really have shit worth nobody wants, right? What's in England? Like the food sucks, it's cold, right? But they have one thing. They have one commodity that there's a high demand for, right? And because it's a cold environment, the sheep in England grow particularly thick, high quality wool. And because people in the British Isles have been, relying on animal husbandry, they've been a pastoral society for thousands of years, right? Before the Romans or the Anglo-Saxons or any of these people, the Normans or any of these people who make up the English today, before any of them arrived, the Celtic people had been there, herding cattle and sheep and everything for millennia, right? And so over this time, people in the British Isles became very proficient in weaving high quality, dense textiles, clothing, wool clothing out of sheep wool, right? And a good quality textile is important, in this time frame, right? Most people only owned one set of clothes, right? It's not like today where we wear a different set of clothes every day, right? And if you wear the same set of clothes all the time, right? Number one, it's cold in Europe in the winter, right? You need to stay warm. And number two, if you're wearing these clothes so much and through all these, horrible, weather and stuff, your clothes, if it's woven loosely, it starts to break down. Like if you have like a sweater that's kind of like a loose weave, it's like it gets damaged easily, right? Whereas if you have a regular, tight knit sweater, it's harder to rip it, right? So people really wanted these textiles, right? Particularly the Dutch and the Netherlands, there was a big market for English textiles. And so lords in England started to think, well, I could make more money if I just fence off part of my lands and just raise sheep there. And then, the peasants can, they'll tend the fields, but then when it's not harvest season, they can be weaving textiles, and then I can sell this and make money and increase my wealth this way, right? So that's what they started doing. And as they start fencing off land, right, it disrupts that system of direct production, right? Direct production is that the peasants, the people who do the work, live on the land, right? And they work the land generation after generation. And they eat the food that they produce, right? And the Lord, whatever's in excess of what's needed to reproduce the population, that's what the Lord gets, right? But if you fence off half your fields, then you're only producing half as much food. And then if you decide, you know what, I'm getting so much money for this wool, I don't need no fucking peasants. I don't need to be raising no wheat in the first place. You fence off all your fields. What happens to the peasants? For generations, as long as they can remember, they've been able to support themselves by working on the land, and they have a right to eat and to produce their own commodities and have their little house and all that, right? And the Lord takes whatever's in excess of the harvest, right? But suddenly when the land is fenced off for these enclosures, people are pushed off the land. And so it renders the peasantry landless, right? And you're thinking too bad for the peasants, right? So what do the peasants have to do now? They got to find a job, right? If you're living in a feudal society, in a medieval or in an ancient society, chances are you're working and you're eating the food that you're producing. And maybe someone with a sword is, taking the excess, whatever. But, you're going to eat and you're going to have a roof over your head. But suddenly when you're rendered landless, the only way you have to support yourself is to work for a wage, and then to use the money you're paid in the wage to buy the food you need to eat and to, pay the rent to stay, have a roof over your head, right? So it puts you in a much more precarious position. And believe me, people were not happy about this. This enclosure movement, it started in England, but it took over a period of, maybe 300 years to work its way through Europe. And then, the last 100 or 200 years through the rest of the world, right? People who've been supporting themselves for millennia are not going to be happy about being removed from the land and told that they have to fend for themselves and work for a wage to survive, right? Who would give up the ability to support themselves and provide for their own sustenance so that they have to go and work for someone else in a position that's not secure or stable? It makes no sense, right? So peasants certainly didn't choose this system. They were forced into this system, right? And this is the invention of, both in the English language and in the, English, imagination, the invention of the pauper and the criminal, right? Think about it. If you're in a society where everyone works and everyone eats what's produced, how the fuck can you be homeless? How can there be poor people? Like you're poor compared to the Lord, right? But everybody works, everybody eats, everybody got a roof over their head. And year by year, you pull the harvest and you reproduce, and your kids do the same thing that you did, right? But now you're in this new position, right? You're stuck and you have to find a job. And if your old Lord won't pay you to do what you used to do for sustenance, you have to go somewhere else, probably to a town or maybe to a city where hopefully you can find some wage labor. And maybe you can find some wage labor, but then maybe they can't make money off your labor anymore, so they cut you loose and you end up in the street, right? That's what a pauper is. That's what homeless people are. We take it for granted in our society. We take homelessness for granted. This is a big issue right now in Los Angeles, especially, right? But the idea of homelessness is only possible because the peasantry, first of England and then the rest of Europe and then the rest of the world, have been rendered landless, right? Think of how many of you can support yourself entirely off your own labor on your own land? How many of you even have the skills to be able to do that, even if you did have the opportunity restored to you? You probably couldn't grow food or take care of animals to save your life, literally, right? We went from being able to being completely self-sufficient in our own immediate needs, our own consumption, to being in a position now where none of us are capable of taking care of ourselves, right? Maybe you thought about this at the beginning of the pandemic. Shit, what if they stop delivering food to the supermarkets? We're all gonna fucking starve. That's what's gonna happen, right? We don't have any way of feeding ourselves. You don't like to think about that because we're used to seeing food in the supermarket, right? But imagine the food don't make it to the supermarket anymore. How are you gonna feed yourself? You're not, right? We're absolutely dependent on this capitalist economy that we're living in, literally to live, or else we die, right? And so you have to work for someone else, unless you're independently wealthy, right? In order to earn a wage to feed yourself and keep a roof over your head and so forth, right? So you can see here, so the pauper, let me talk about the criminal, right? So this is also really the invention of crime as we think about it, right? In this time period, people who have been rendered landless and have no way to support themselves and can't find work, right? Worst comes to worst, are gonna commit crimes. They're either gonna beg, right? Or they're gonna steal. Right? Those are your only options left, or you're going to starve, right? And so there's this growing population in English towns and cities of people who have no home, no way to support themselves, and beg and and commit petty crimes in order to be able to provide for their sustenance, right? So this is a problematic population. And so not only, stealing and begging become outlawed, but literally being jobless and homeless becomes outlawed. They actually made it illegal in 14th century, in 16th century, in the 1500s in England. They made it illegal to be landless and jobless. So if you can't find someone, a lord, or someone who owns a land or a textile manufacturing, operation or something, you can't get somebody to hire you, right? First time they whip you, right? They whip you half to death. Second time they brand your face with a hot iron. It's like across the whole side of your cheek and ear and head and everything. And the third time they chop your head off simply for being jobless and homeless, right? Why is it morally okay to do barbaric things like that? Think about this Protestant ethic. If this person has been abandoned by God where they have no way to support themselves, then clearly they're damned. Right? See the theological basis for this way of thinking, right? And so if they're apparently damned and their condition, their economic, their financial condition reflects that, then we should kill them. There's no problem with killing them in that case, right? See what's going on here? So it puts the peasantry in a, very, in a tight situation, right? Now, to make matters worse, the amount of land that's owned by people starts to, the estates start to grow. The crown allows people to, so what happens, how this starts is the lords, right? They're enclosing their land for the sheep, right? And then the lords think, well, you know what? Like I can, instead of having the peasants work the fields, right? I can lease out my fields to one of the peasants or to whoever enterprising, entrepreneur wants to make a bid. And, instead of having to deal with this thing of lean year, big harvest and small harvest, I'll have them bid. And then, let's say, I get somebody bids 20 bushels of wheat. Let me take over this field for the next year. Next harvest, I give you 20 bushels of wheat. I'll keep the rest. And someone else says, I'll give you 50 bushels, right? And then someone else says, I'll give you 80 bushels, right? And then someone else says, I'll give you 100 bushels. Well, the person that's offering the 100 bushels is hoping that he's going to be able to produce 120 bushels so that he gives the 100 to the landowner and he keeps 20 for himself, right? If all goes, great and dandy, he might end up with 200 bushels and give 100 to the landowner and have 100 for himself and be able to lease another plot of land. Now he's got 2 plots of land he's leasing for 100 bushels each. See how, so people who are good at flipping this, right, they end up acquiring control of more and more land, right? And that further cuts, gradually erases the amount of land that's inhabited by the peasants. And so more and more peasants become rendered landless. Some of them are employed at a wage, doing the same labor on the same land that they always had, right? But others of them have to, travel to villages and towns and cities to try and find work, or end up, involved in, predatory criminal activity or, theft or at the least begging, right? And so eventually all of the land in England, right, gets eaten up by this system of market leases and rents and so forth, right? And there's actually, rent is a word that we use in our language that really originally referred to farmland. We think of rent as like, I'm paying my rent for the house that I live in or whatever, right? But this system of renting out farmland is where this, not just the word, but the concept of paying rent for the right to occupy some piece of property, right? That's where the idea, much less the word, came from. Another word that should be obvious, landlord. Who do you pay your rent to? To the landlord. Why are they called the landlord? Because they're the lord that owns the land, right? This is, 500 years ago. See what I'm saying? So that's where these concepts that we kind of take for granted as part of the capitalist system emerged. Marx and Engels call this initial period of agrarian capitalism primitive accumulation. It's not like there's factories and, big industry and stuff. The only industry is, sheep husbandry, textiles, and, growing wheat for the most part, wheat and barley, right? But this is, the time period, this is where the concepts that become capitalism emerged, right? So one of them is the concept of private property. What did they call, who call what? I said a lot of things. Which one? You can verbalize if, Marx and Weber called it primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation, this first stage of agrarian capitalism, right? So this is where private property, the concept of private property as we know established, right? If you're fencing off land and you're kicking, the people who are indigenous to that land off the land, right? And you're renting it to someone else and trying to maximize your profits, right? And remember the theological background here. If you're making a lot of money doing this, right, that's a symbol that you're one of the people that God has chosen, right? So they're not just doing this, for the money. They're doing it, because the money is a symbol that their soul will be saved, right? And so the right of lords and renters to render the population landless and to enforce their property rights and their contracts, right, becomes a fundamental aspect of the legal system, of English jurisprudence, which of course the American legal system is based on the English system. So this you're taking lands that are basically communal, where everybody in the community works on them and everybody eats off of them, right? Even though there's a guy with a sword and a big stone castle on the hill who could kill us all if he wants, but he doesn't because he needs us to work every year for him to get his part too, right? This communal system, this feudal communal system, to a system where you're just scattering the whole community. All of these peasants, right? Just feathers in the wind, right? And wherever they end up. And some of them are able to continue to work in the agrarian economy as they would have, but those whose labor is no longer needed, end up landless and in the cities and homeless and poor and eventually are, if they don't engage in crimes, are criminalized simply for being homeless and landless. So after this was already happening, the people who were benefiting from this, right, the gentry, the wealthy people, came up with reasonings, frameworks for justifying what was already happening, right? And we're going to see the same type of story when we look at the race concept. So kind of the big four, classical economists that you're probably familiar with is John Locke, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and David Ricardo, right? All Englishmen, all landed gentry, right? These are wealthy people who are coming up with justifications for the property interests that they spend their lives pursuing, right? And what is their justification? Is laissez, you know what we in French, laissez-faire, which basically translate to do what you want, right? And that's what they want. They want to be able to do whatever they want with whoever they want to achieve their goals of amassing wealth, right? And there's a key difference here in the wealth that they're amassing versus the medieval times, right? So they're accumulating wealth as a sign of, you know, religious favor, but what are they doing with that wealth? Are they keeping it, you know, in a grain silo or, you know, in a chest, you know, buried in the ground somewhere? No, they're taking the profit that they're making and they're reinvesting it, right? So if you lease a field and you got to pay 100 bushels and you end up producing 200 bushels, well, then you don't take that extra 100 bushels and just sit on it. You use it to, next season, you're planting 2 fields. And if you're lucky, you'll have 400 bushels, right? So you're taking the money, the wealth that you're producing, and you're reinvesting it with the intention of producing more wealth, which you then further reinvest, which produces even more wealth, which you further reinvest ad infinitum, right? And that is unique to capitalism, right? People didn't do that prior to 16th century England, right? This enclosure movement and system of land leases and rents is what, you know, created this, along with the theology of, you know, Protestant anxiety over, you know, whether they're going to heaven or not, created this type of motivation in people to want to accumulate wealth to no end, basically, right? So so the liberty that that, you know, Locke and Bentham and, you know, and the free trade that, you know, Adam Smith and Ricardo are talking about, right? This isn't the freedom for the workers, is it? Right? The workers were, you know, had no freedom. They were, if you were working for a wage for someone in England during this time, you had to live in the company house, you had to shop in the company store, you had to eat the company food. You were basically a slave in any other name. You're a wage slave, right? And unlike chattel slavery, you know, in chattel slavery, you're actually worth something because you can be sold. But in wage slavery, you ain't worth shit. They could just cut you loose. Bye, Felicia, that's it. Right? So you have no long-term security at all. Right? You're not allowed
you
to.
Also, like, oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
couldn't they also keep you because you had, like, obviously the wages weren't enough to live by. They basically had them go into debt and have them work it off, right? It's kind of like the same thing that they did in the encomiendas and all that stuff.
But well, the encomiendas were different though, because in the encomienda system, right, the people who are working are not being paid a wage.
At all.
They're tied to the land. They're tied to the estate. Even though this is in Mesoamerica or you know, the northern part of South America, whatever, what's now Venezuela, Colombia, whatever. That's the same system, that's the same feudal system from Europe, essentially transplanted, right? It's not wage slavery, it's, you know, it's serfdom. Serfdom.
I know there's another name for it. Maybe I'm confusing it. You're right on that, though. I'm wrong on that
happens
bit.
to be there, yeah. So that's very different from this system that the English are practicing, right? So this system that the English are practicing, this is the beginning of capitalism, right? And why is it qualitatively, you know, distinct from prior forms of economic and political organization? right? Because number one, why they're accumulating wealth for theological reason, but moreover, they're accumulating wealth in order to reinvest it to create more wealth, to reinvest to create more wealth, to infinity. And how is the labor being provided here in this new system? People are working for a wage instead of people being tied to the land, right? And so it creates a much more unstable existence for the people who do the work, because they have to find someone to work for a wage in order to survive. And the people that they work for the wage have no responsibility to them, long term. They can cut them loose at any time and replace them, right? The only bottom limit of the people who are employing them is that they need to pay them or feed them enough to make sure that there's still people to continue to work. Other than that, they could care less who or how many people die. As long as there's enough people to still do the work, then so be it. And as we're going to find out in a couple of weeks, if there's too many people and they're in our streets and, begging and stealing, well, then we'll just put them on a boat and send them to another continent so they can work over there, right? And that's the indentured labor system. So we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when we talk about the emergence of the race concept. Let's see. Yeah, so I guess that's about it. Any questions before I cut you guys loose? So this is the beginning of capitalism, right? And it's this system that the English transport to their colonies, which is different from the mercantile systems that the Portuguese and Dutch were engaging in, different from the feudal encomienda system, a plantation system that the Portuguese and Spanish were engaging in their colonies, right? When the English came to the New World, they came and set up, individual plots, businesses, right? People accumulate, were granted or purchased rights to different plots of land and grew cash crops, right? In order to produce wealth with which to buy more and more land, right? And at first the cash crop was tobacco, and then eventually, cotton and rice and whatever else. So we'll talk about all that in a couple of weeks. And I think that's all I have to say. Any last questions before I cut you loose?
I do. I found something in the reading that kind of made sense, but then kind of tricked me off. It was talking about descendant wages, something about that.
The what?
Descendant wages. So kind of like when they were starting to get paid, like depending on the area, like how poor your ancestors were or something.
Oh, yeah. So they were, of course, people who were employers want to pay the lowest wage they possibly can, right? And so who is going to accept the lowest wage is the poorest people. So if you want to set up a textile workshop or, factory, whatever, or, you want to, have some estate or whatever, you want to do it in a place where there's a lot of these landless peasants who've been rendered destitute by the enclosure movement, right? Every landless peasant is an opportunity, a labor to be exploited by employers, right? So it makes perfect sense that people like Locke and Smith and Bentham and and Ricardo were encouraging and justifying this system because they were profiting from it, right? They weren't talking about the freedom, the liberty that this country was founded on wasn't the liberty of people who do the work. It's the liberty of people who own the property, right? Cool. Any other questions or comments? All right. Have a lovely weekend. Stay cool. Enjoy the last
Question.
bit of our summer. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So I see that we have an assignment due on the 22, right?
So it's not due next week, but the week after. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I sound a little dumb or whatnot.
Or is it? I don't know. What do I? Let me take a look at my notes.
I was wondering if Maddie, hold on, baby. Hold on, baby. I was wondering, like, to find the material of the questions that you're asking for, are they based on the books or on the lectures? Because I was trying to find them on, like, key points through the lectures, and I really don't see it.
23rd. Okay, so the paper is due 2 weeks from today. And you're asking where is the prompt for the paper?
So the prompt is already posted.
Yeah, the prompt is on Canvas.
Clearly see it. To find the correct answers or what, are they based on the books that we had to?
It's based on everything. So you answering the prompt for the paper is, anything in your readings and anything from my lecture is fair game.
Okay, yeah, because I was like trying to find like the key points through the lectures and the lecture notes that you have.
Yeah, so the lecture notes that I posted is just really my own personal notes, just to remind me of what I need to keep talking about.
Okay.
But it's, you can kind of use it for key concepts or maybe to remember back when I was talking about whatever. But you're more than welcome to use content from my lectures. You probably will need to use content from my lectures in addition to the reading. Obviously, what I lecture on is a hell of a lot more material than what I could assign you to read in a week. You know what I mean? Your reading is just kind of like the bare bones of the whole big lecture that I give you, right?
And another thing too, how would you want us to answer it? Like in a essay format or just like the
Essay format, continuous paragraphs, and in the order that the questions are asked in the prompt. More or less, like if you have a paragraph for each question, you'll end up having, a 4-page essay, which is what you need. So 4 pages double spaced.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. No formal citations, none of that MLA, APA, I'm not going to beat you with that stick. What I want is the content, right? But I want your content. Don't, not you. I know you don't do this, but just as a warning to everybody, please don't be copying stuff off the internet, right?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right. Anybody else?
Oh, hello. So with like all the philosophy of like Locke and freedom, like no government intervention, and it kind of like fueled like private property and exploitation, right? So because it was nothing like feudalism, when it was kind of like more like had no money involved, like kind of like a bartering system, like you stay in my land, I give you protection, I give you food. Then capitalism is just like private exploitation between like laborers and like
capitalism just like obliterated the social relations that had existed prior through all of history, right? Like through all of history, our ancestors, wherever you are from in the world, your ancestors probably produced the vast majority of what they consumed and used.
Yeah,
right?
so and it was all like justified during this time, right? From Locke
and so it's just this last 500 years that we're rendered in this position of being landless and unable to support ourselves, that we all have to work for somebody to be able to, unless we're the employer, we're the capitalist, right?
Yeah,
you're
and
either
I
a
read
capitalist or a worker. There's no in between.
And also
capitalists can't not do it either, because they have to make money or they're going to starve too.
Oh, like in the readings too, like it was showing how like children, I guess young as like 12 and 14, they even got like exploited with like the laborers too, right?
Even younger than that, man, not even just the last 100 years, they've been sending 6-year-olds into mines, and yeah, man, there's no limit to what, you know, employers will do if they're allowed to, right? I think a key point there, you know, with the classical theorists, you know, is that they're all talking about all this freedom and, you know, liberty and stuff. They're talking about their freedom, their liberty of exploiting other people and their property rights is what they're really talking about. They're certainly not talking about the freedom of the people doing the labor, right? The people who are the ones that actually do the labor are held in, you know, have horrible circumstances that they cannot change. They're not allowed to change. They're not allowed to revolt against, right? So whose liberty, right? I mean, that's probably even more obvious in our own Constitution, right? Our Constitution, you know, liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all that, right? It's a bunch of bullshit, right? In the Constitution, it says a Black person is worth 3/5 of a person. Is it for their liberty? 3/5 for the portion of a purpose of apportionment of representation that certainly didn't represent their interests, right? So it's obvious that even in our own country, our own Constitution, our own legal system, right? From the founding of this country, right? It was people who own property are the ones who had political rights, right? That not everyone else, you know, so.
The irony of us basing most of our like major writings on some of these philosophers and stuff like that were arguing for this type of stuff.
It's not irony, it's indoctrination. You know, it's funny, like these right-wing sycophants, you know, say that leftist professors are indoctrinating our children with critical race theory and cultural Marxism, or that is shit they don't even know about, right? But actually, like, all of us were brought up like with reading all this bullshit political theory, Locke and Smith, and you know, and if you're an econ major, what do you read? Smith and Ricardo and maybe Bentham and whatever. This is like the core, you know, the core material for our whole society. This is what our founding fathers were reading. They loved John Locke and Adam Smith, especially John Locke. Oh, they love that, right? But you know, we got to think a little more critically, like, wait a minute, whose liberty are they talking about here? Right? Liberty sounds great, you know, hey, libertad, like the, you know, the El Libertador, the Bolivar, right? Simon Bolivar liberated South America from the Spanish so that he could be dictator of Pan-Colombia. What the fuck kind of revolution is this? Liberty for who? Right? Wait a minute. We just fought this whole war and now you're going to be dictator? Right? Fortunately, he died of dysentery, so you know his plans came to naught. But this is a story everywhere, right? It ain't no American Revolution, my ass. Real revolution for who? Right? It was just a matter of their property rights being protected from the crown, right? Which is a medieval thing. In the medieval sovereign, the sovereign can take the land from whoever he wants. The nobles only have. The Lord has rights to the land because the sovereign has granted them. So the sovereign can take that back at any time. So what the American Revolution is doing is saying, no, we're keeping our property and you ain't taking it from us. You don't have the right to take it from us. The revolution for this country was about property rights. It wasn't about, you know, liberty. Ridiculous. So anyways, this isn't a political science class, but hope you have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you next Thursday. So next Thursday we'll do it. It'll be theory. We'll be talking about Marx. Probably won't be quite as long a lecture because it's not so much history. So go ahead and give it a read. See if you can make some sense out of it. You're welcome to, you know, Google different concepts from the readings to try and, you know, maybe get the Cliff Notes. But just please don't copy nothing off the internet. That's the only thing I ask. All right.
Thank you.
Buenas noches.